Welcome to another in our seminar series. Today's seminar is on the Social Progress Index, and it will focus on the Social Progress Index from 1990 to 2020, measuring societal well-being over 31 years. Today's seminar is presented by Professor Jaromir Harmáček. And let me tell you about Professor Harmáček. Professor Harmáček is the Global Research Director at the Social Progress Imperative. He conducts research and analysis primarily at the global level, but has also participated in various research initiatives at the subnational level. Jaromir has a substantive academic background as well. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Development and Environmental Studies at Palacký University Olomouc. I hope I got that Olomouc, I should say, Czech Republic. He has 2 master's degrees and earned his PhD, as well as the title of Associate Professor in International Economic Relations at the University of Economics in Prague. I'm excited to hear and to present Jaromir to our audience to share with us his insightful knowledge on the Social Progress Index. So Jaromir, over to you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yonette, for the very nice introduction. It's my honor to be here today, to have the opportunity to present our work on the Social Progress Index 1990 to 2020. Before I start, I would like to thank once again to all the organizers of this event and to the International Panel on Social Progress for the opportunity to be here. So let me pull up the presentation. Now, I hope that my slides are visible to everyone. This presentation is based on a peer-reviewed paper officially published earlier this year in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. It's been published online since 2025, and maybe to explain the year's discrepancy, because now we have 2026, but the end year of the time series of the index is 2020. We started working on the index already in 2020. Most significant part of this work was carried out in 2022 and 2023. We finalized the index in 2023, and then we submitted the paper in 2024. So there is a delay between the official publication and the creation of the index. However, we are currently working on an update of this time series index, which may actually be out later this year. So there is definitely something to look forward to. I have already been introduced, so I don't think I need to repeat my affiliation and the work that I currently do. So let me skip to the presentation and let me already start. So this is the outline of my presentation. Since I think that not all of you may be familiar with what the Social Progress Index is, before I jump to the Social Progress Index time series, I will briefly introduce the concept and the principles of the Social Progress Index. Because every year at the Social Progress Imperative, we publish the Global Social Progress Index. So this year we published the 2026 Global Social Progress Index, in which we usually back calculate only to 2011. So this time series index, which I'm going to focus my presentation on, is different. But basic principles and the framework of the index are similar to what we do every year. So I'll start with the concept and principles of the Social Progress Index, which were kept also for the time series index. Then I'll speak about the time series index, so Social Progress Index 1990 to 2020. I will first focus on the methodology of the calculation, and then I'll speak on the results and trends that we found based on the index. And then, because it's been already some time, since we've published the index, so I will also focus on some extensions of the research based on the time series index. So I will focus very briefly on our research on global societal outcomes, inequalities, and convergence. So maybe we can start with why actually we should measure societal outcomes and why we should measure social progress. It's simple. We cannot focus only on economic outcomes and on economic indicators. For example, GDP is a very important measure, but it measures economic activity. It's not a measure of the quality of life. Also, if we focus only on economic indicators, there's no guarantee that economic development will automatically generate social progress. And also, if we focus on social outcomes, we may also see that the social outcomes support economic development. So we need to measure social outcomes independently of economic development, separately from economic development. In this regard, we can consider the Social Progress Index to belong to the broader beyond GDP agenda because it measures what people experience and not what economies actually produce. So what is the definition of social progress? So here's the definition that the social progress imperative uses to define social progress. So as you can see, social progress is the capacity of a society to meet the basic human needs of its citizens, establish the building blocks that allow citizens and communities to enhance and sustain the quality of their lives, and create the conditions for all individuals to reach their full potential. Now, you can see that based on the definition, there are already three building blocks of the index, three dimensions of the index: basic needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And this definition actually moves the definition of the social progress from survival and safety through the foundations of a good life to the freedom to reach one's potential. Now, the Social Progress Index is a composite measure. It is a composite index of societal well-being and or quality of life based on the three dimensions that you have just seen: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. It is also a multidimensional measure that is built exclusively from social and environmental outcome indicators. This means that no economic indicator is actually included in the framework of the index, a principle that I will come back to a little bit later. Also, this index is decomposable into parts of the index. So we can decompose the score of the index, the final measure, the Social Progress Index, into its dimensions, the three that you have seen already, components, which I'll cover shortly, and even individual indicators that make up each component. And a very important point, the Social Progress Index has been a complement to GDP. It has always been thought as a complement to GDP, not a replacement for it. So basically, what we do usually is that we measure social outcomes, Social Progress Index, in terms of the three dimensions and 12 components, separately from GDP. But since we measure them separately, we may also put them together to create a measure that looks at economic development as well as societal development. So for example, GDP per capita as the economic measure and the Social Progress Index as the measure of societal outcomes. And the fact that we are measuring economic development separately from societal outcomes allows us to look at the relationship between economic development, GDP per capita, and social progress. Here on the slide, you can see the measure of economic development, GDP per capita, on the horizontal axis, while the social progress index scores are on the vertical axis. And what we can see here is that First, GDP is not a destiny. Usually, richer countries generally achieve higher levels of social progress. The relationship also shows a diminishing returns to higher income levels. But what we can also see is that basically at every income level, some countries are better in turning their economic resources, GDP per capita, into the social outcome, social progress. So in no way it is that the GDP is a destiny. Let's come back now to the SPI framework. So from the definition, you've seen already that the index consists of 3 dimensions: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And each of these dimensions consists of 4 components. So that's another building block of the index. So as you can see, in basic human needs, we have 4 components: nutrition and basic medical care, water and sanitation, shelter, personal safety. In the foundations of well-being dimension, we have access to basic knowledge, access to information and communication, health and wellness, and environmental quality. Again, 4 components. And in the last dimension, we have 4 components of rights, freedoms, inclusiveness, and advanced education. I should maybe say that for the global annual editions of the index, some components have already been renamed slightly. Since the paper that I'm presenting uses the old name, so I'm also presenting the old names of the components here. Now, each of the 12 components usually includes 3 to 6, more frequently 4 to 6 individual indicators that should follow the guiding question that you see under each of the component to measure the concept. So for example, if we want to measure health, we ask the question, do people live long and healthy lives? And we try to find 4 to 6 indicators that work together nicely and that they also meet other requirements so that we can use them in this component to actually measure the component. So based on this structure and based on this framework, we usually calculate the component scores, the dimension scores, and the index score. The overall index score usually summarizes the performance of countries, while if we want to do a deeper policy diagnosis, then we have to look at the dimensions or components or even indicators. Now, for the selection of indicators into the individual components, what we need to follow are some rules, and some of the rules are defined by the Social Progress Index design principles. We have 4 principles. The first one and the second one are probably the most important ones. So the first one is that we only use measures, or the Social Progress Index uses only measures that focus on social and environmental outcomes. And that's actually the second principle, that we focus on measuring outcomes, not inputs. The third principle says that if we want to measure progress globally, we need to use indicators that are relevant to basically all countries. And the fourth principle says that if there are 2 indicators out of which you can choose, then you should be preferring the one that is more actionable in terms of policy making decisions. These principles are very relevant for selecting indicators into the index framework. So basically, if we want to select indicators into the index framework, so we usually focus separately on each component of the index. And in selecting the indicators, we need to reflect the following criteria: the conceptual fit, the technical quality or the technical criteria, and the statistical fit. In terms of the conceptual fit, we need our indicators to reflect the 4 design principles that I was just talking about. They need to respond to the guiding question for that component. Then we have the technical criteria. So we need to have data that comes from reputable sources that are recent and that have a good geographic coverage of the data. And then we look at the statistical fit. So in terms of statistics, we actually evaluate univariate and multivariate statistics. Univariate, how the values are distributed for that specific indicators, whether there are missing values, whether there are outliers, what we do with the outliers, whether the distribution is skewed, how much it is skewed, and so on. And in terms of the multivariate fit, we test how the indicators within a component work together. Whether if we put them together, whether they create and measure the component, the concept that they should measure. And there are some methods that we use to evaluate this. For example, correlations between the indicators. We use principal component factor, something that I'll come back to a little bit later. We use measures as Cronbach's alpha or the Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin statistic to evaluate whether the indicators actually create a coherent and consistent component. So this is the basics of the social progress index in general. This is what we follow no matter whether we create a social progress index for countries globally, the annual social progress index, the global social progress index, or whether we use some other variants of the index on the level of countries or even subnationally. And these were also the basic principles that we followed when we were creating this application, the time series index, a social progress index that went back to 1990. Of course, there were many specifics which we had to solve somehow. So let me now cover the methodology of the time series index, the social progress index 1990-2020. Once I cover this, we look at the results that we got. So the main thing is that the time series index extends the idea of the social progress index back to 1990. As I said, annually we publish the global social progress index, which goes back to 2011. So for the 2026 social progress index, the most up-to-date edition, we measure social progress index from 2011 to 2025. So this time series index extended the social progress index back to 1990. So we got a full time series coverage, and we then could use it to look at more long-term trends in social progress. The contribution of the paper and of our effort and of this index was not simply that we had more years. We need to realize that this was another new measurement system that actually allowed us to measure social progress over a longer period of time and across basically the same number of countries as we do it annually. So we were able to calculate the social progress index time series for 172 countries with complete coverage, and then we had 24 additional countries with a partial coverage. That means that for the 172 countries, we were able to calculate all components of social progress, all three dimensions, and the index as well. For the additional 24 countries, we were only able to calculate some components, and in some better cases, also some dimensions, but we were not able to calculate the full index. The index was based on 52 social and environmental outcome indicators, which were supported by additional 13 indicators. For all these indicators, we used 12 public and international comparable data sources, and all of this resulted in one fixed framework and common scoring boundaries across all years and all countries. So, and yes, I didn't say that the time series actually includes 31 annual observations, so from 1990 to 2020. Based on the rules on selecting of indicators, these are the indicators that we used to calculate the social progress index time series 1990 to 2020. Of course, I will not go through all these indicators. Just this is rather for illustration. These are the 52 indicators that we use to measure first the components, then from the components the dimensions, and then from dimensions the final social progress index. I should also maybe say, and I haven't said it yet, that since these indicators are slightly different from what we use in the annual editions of the index, and of course, because also the calibration of each indicators is different when compared to the annual index. This index, the time series index, is not directly comparable to what we publish annually because of these methodological differences. You can compare trends, you can compare ranks, but you cannot compare directly the scores. Of course, with going back to 1990, we had to solve some methodological issues. One of them was that we started this work already in 2020, as I said, and we wanted to go back to 1990s. And luckily, we were able to go until 1990. But the index is actually anchored in the present. So to measure social progress in the early 90s, we are actually using the understanding of social progress, the present understanding of social progress. And that, of course, brought some, I don't want to say complications, but maybe issues that we had to solve. For example, what to do with the changing technology. One of the components of the index is information and communications. And we somehow had to solve this issue to bridge a landline world in the 90s with a mobile and internet world in the 2020s. So that was particularly an issue that we actually had to solve somehow. Also, since we wanted to have a global comparability of data and the measurements, so we were thinking of some locally more important topics, but we decided not to include them because we would not have a consistent data, global data. One, and second, one of the principles of the social progress index says that the data, the indicators, they need to be relevant to all countries. So that is something that we couldn't do. And of course, for some issues that we ideally would like to or wanted to have in the index framework, such as mental health or different kinds of rights or data focused on migrants, other minorities, they were not available. So we could not use these kind of data that ideally we would want to use. And also, because of all these delays that I actually started talking about at the beginning, the series now ends in 2020, and therefore it does not capture basically any social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is not actually shown in the data yet. But as I said at the beginning, we are now working on an update of this time series index. So we hope that some of these consequences will be seen in the update. Since the paper was published in a methodological journal, methodology of the calculation of the index is quite an important part of the paper. So let me very briefly show you how the methodology, calculation methodology of the index works. So it's basically it's based on 9 steps that are linked together, and you can see them on the slide. So first, we had to calculate some of the indicators that we wanted to use. using supporting indicators. We had to address missing values. We had to treat outliers. We had to calibrate indicators using best and worst case scenarios. We had to invert indicators where they were negatively related to social progress. So basically, all indicators need to be oriented in a way that higher values are showing better results. And for some indicators, this is not the case. For example, mortality indicators. So these indicators had to be inverted. Then we estimated the components, component weights and calculated component scores. We aggregated then the components into dimensions and dimensions into the final index. We tested statistical validity of the index, and then we recalculated the index using alternative specification to see whether the results that we got were robust or not to these different alternative specifications. And so let me show you some more details of this calculation methodology. So in terms of missing data, we preferred the simplest possible method. So for country series data, if data was missing at the beginning or at the end of a country series, we carry future or historical values backward or forward, but not for more than 5 consecutive years. If there was a gap inside a country series, then we linearly interpolated the gaps, but only gaps that were no more than 14 consecutive years. For longer gaps, either at the beginning or at the end of a series or in between observations, we used regression-based predictions, usually done in a way that one indicator was always the dependent variable and all other indicators from that component served as predictors. And for some additional indicators, we also did pre-imputations to actually make sure that we will be able to have this full sample of countries. So this is how we handled missing data. Of course, as I said, we needed to calculate some indicators. So one of these issues that I was talking about was how we wanted to calculate or how we wanted to solve the issue of changing technology. So we were thinking how to do this, and one of the ideas that we then realized and implemented was that we took the series of landline subscriptions and mobile subscriptions and combined them together with counter-parallel weights across 6 5-year periods. And that provided us an indicator of a changing technology. At the beginning of the 1990s, we focused more, or we put more weights on the landline subscriptions, and by the end of the time series, we actually put more weight on the mobile subscriptions. We also calculated indicators focused on gender parity. So we measured gender parity as the absolute distance from the ratio of female to male indicator, so that we recognize disadvantage on either side of 1, which was the ideal parity scenario. For the update, we are actually already doing this differently. That's one note that I wanted to say. We also combined some comparable concepts. For example, we had indicators on fruits and vegetable risks in diet, and they were measured on the same scale, and conceptually they are very similar. So we combined them together, and we did the same also for estimates in educational attainment, secondary education, and tertiary as well. Of course, the objective of calculating the indicator was not to create a maximal number of indicators, but to create a conceptual consistency over time. In terms of transformations, we had some specific rules to calculate the index. So, for example, we decided to transform skewed indicators using the following rule. So, if the skewness coefficient was larger than 2, then we applied a square root transformation. Originally, we wanted to apply a logarithmic transformation, but then we decided not to do it because that distorted the data too much. Luckily, only 2 indicators required such a transformation, and that was the lead exposure indicator and interpersonal violence indicator. If the skewness coefficient was between 1.5 and 2, we created a cap at the first or 99th percentile to lower the skewness, or we focused on the Winsorization of some extreme outliers to lower the skewness. And for some indicators, we actually used theoretical caps where the unit demanded to do so. So, for example, the phone subscriptions indicator was always calculated to 100 people. Now, what was one of the most difficult things when creating the index was to choose the way we wanted to calibrate the indicators through so-called best cases or worst cases scenario. So for the best cases scenario, we usually used a predefined or natural boundary where there was one. For example, for maternal death, the best case scenario we used was 0. If there was an indicator showing service coverage, such as access to electricity, or some other indicators, we actually used the full coverage as the best case scenario. For the worst cases, it was a bit more difficult, and many indicators actually didn't have a predefined boundary. So for these indicators, we usually use the worst observed performance in the time period under coverage. So the worst performance, the worst observed value in 1990 and 2020 time series. These worst case and best case scenario we then used through a simple min-max procedure to convert all indicators to a common 0-100 scale, 0-100 range, and then after this we actually calculated the component scores as well as, and then continued with the aggregation. Also, what needs to be also noted is that 25 indicators had to be inverted so that higher values always indicated better social progress. To aggregate indicators values to component scores, we used principal component factor analysis, which helped us to derive weights of individual indicators within the components. So this was the method used to aggregate indicators into components. And once we had component scores, then we aggregated the component scores into dimension scores through arithmetic average. And then using arithmetic average of the dimensions, we calculated the index score. Of course, here we could debate whether different methods of aggregation could have been used. For example, whether the compensability of scores would have been an issue or not. And I think that this is something that we can come back to in the discussion if there are questions around it. In the last steps of the index calculation, we made sure that all criteria that we set to us in terms of validity and robustness are satisfied. They were, so we used this Cronbach alpha coefficient and Kaiser-Meyer-Olking statistic. We use these rules of thumbs for the Cronbach's alpha. Every component should be at least at 0.7 value, KMO at least at 0.5 values, and this was met for all components. And we also focused on one factor structure, meaning that only one eigenvalue in a component should be above 1 and all the others below 1, and this was met as well. And in terms of robustness checks, we calculated alternative specifications and then look at Spearman rank correlations and Pearson's correlations and the differences between scores for individual countries and ranks between individual countries. And we considered the way of calculating this index based on these results robust. So this is the methodology of the index calculation, which was the more important part of the paper because it was published in the International Journal of Social Research Methodology. Now, in terms of the results, so based on the way we calculated the index and we extended the social progress index into the year 1990 from 2020. So what we've seen is that the world gained more than 13 points in the social progress index over 1990 to 2020. Here I should say that we calculated the index for countries, but also what we did is that we population weighted the raw indicators before calculation to create aggregation for the world and for the global regions. And we calculated the social progress index scores also for the world and for the region. So basically considering them as additional countries. Based on this, we can see that the World Social Progress Index rose by more than 13 points, and also that all 3 dimensions improved over the full period. So here on the left panel, you can see the index and the 3 dimensions, all of them improving. But if you look at the opportunity dimension, the 3rd dimension, you see that the improvement is quite modest. We're talking about an improvement over 31 years. So it's been really modest. Now, in the right panel of this image, what you can see are the individual components, the 4 components of the basic human needs dimension. And here you can see that also these components improved. But again, there is one component that didn't improve that much, and that's the safety component. For the other dimensions components, so if we look at the foundations of well-being component, we can see that the best performing component was the information and communications component, which rose from scores lower than 20 to scores around 70, so very, very significantly on the global level. On the other hand, the results are much more varied if we look at the last dimension, the opportunity dimension. We see that there are actually some components that stagnated over the full period of time, which is the rights components, which improved only by 0.63 points. But also, there is one component that actually declined, the only component that declined over those 31 years, and that's the inclusiveness component. So the results on the level of component are quite varied. Here, you can see the results of the index dimensions and components for the full period, then for individual decades, and then for 5-year periods. And this is to show you the 3 big takeaways from the results. That the results or the achievements in social progress were uneven in terms of components of social progress, then over time, and then across countries, which is something that I will show you on the next slide. So if we look at the different components of social progress, and we've already seen it, so over the full period, we can see that some components improved dramatically, such as the first three components of the basic human needs dimension, or access to information and communications. But on the other hand, there are some components that almost didn't improve, such as safety or environmental quality or personal rights, or there is one component that actually decreased, the inclusiveness. And of course, these results vary even more if we decompose them into decades or the 5-year periods. The main takeaway in terms of the uneven achievements over time is that social progress has significantly slowed down. So the best decade in terms of social progress achievement was the middle one from 2000 to 2010. And the last one, the last decade, was actually the worst one. And in terms of the 5-year periods, this actually holds as well. So the last 5-year period is the worst, and you can see that there are actually three components that declined over the period. It's safety, it's rights, and it's inclusiveness. And this is actually something that we also see. I said that we should not be comparing the time series index with the annual global index, but we should not be comparing it in terms of scores, but we can be comparing it in terms of trends. And this is exactly what we see when we look at the trends over time using the Global Social Progress Index. In the most recent years, unfortunately, social progress has slowed down in terms of different components and for many, many significant countries. Speaking about the level of countries, if we compare the distribution of scores in the 1990 and 2020, so we can see that the score levels improved for basically all countries. But the differences among countries persisted. I have some slides here showing how the distribution of scores changed for the index, for the dimensions, and for the components. So these box plots, they show the level and the variability of the scores, not scores changes, but the scores in 1990 and in 2020. And you can see that, for example, for the basic human needs component, countries are doing better in 2020 than they were doing in 1990, and they are also more similar. The same thing we can see when we look at foundations of well-being. But the third dimension, opportunity, is showing a different result. Here, countries remain very different, and they did not improve that significantly over those 31 years. Of course, the same thing we can do when we look at the individual components. So here we see the distributions of scores in 1990 and 2020 for the individual components. And we can see that the convergence, if I may say so, is far weaker across these individual components, and with very, very different results, actually. Going to the level of countries, the overall pattern shows that basically all countries improved, and many countries, most of them, improved significantly by at least 10 points over those 31 years. Actually, there is only one country that had a lower score in 2020 than in 1990, and that is Venezuela. So if you look at the largest score gains versus lowest score gains, you can see that among the largest score gains, you see countries that began farther from the upper boundary, so whose level of social progress was lower in the 1990s. So one of the best performing countries in terms of the change in social progress over 1990 to 2020 are Bhutan, the Maldives, Myanmar, Ethiopia, or Cambodia. On the other hand, we see countries, as mentioned already, Venezuela, but also Tajikistan, Nicaragua, and some other Eastern European countries, Belarus or Ukraine. We see that some of the worst performing countries in this regard are Eastern European countries because of the transformation that they had to go through in the 90s, which actually lowered the level of economic and also social development. So that's why we see some of these countries among the lower score gaining countries. If we look at rankings, so we see some persistence and some movement. So if we look at the top 10 countries in 1990, so we see that 7 of them are still in the top 10 in 2020. And similarly, if we do the same thing for the bottom 10 countries, so what we see that is that 5 of the bottom 10 countries in 1990 also remained in the bottom 10 in 2020. You see some of the largest rank gains countries and some of the lowest rank gains countries. So to some extent that also overlaps with what we've seen on the previous slide. But there are some other notable results, such as, for example, that the United States fell from the 8th position in the world in 1990 to the 31st position in the world in 2020. So a significant decline in terms of the world ranking for the United States. When we created the index, so we also created interactive visualizations, and they are still available on the Social Progress Imperative website. And they show very interesting things. One of them, for example, that if we look at one of the most developed countries, the G7 countries. So what we see here is that from 1990 to 2020, these countries were originally improving, but they then actually reached a plateau and some of them started to decline. So if you look, for example, at the trend of the United States, so you see that until 2015, 2016, United States were still improving in social progress, and then they started declining. And similar trends are actually seen for some other countries lately as well. Of course, the country performance depends on the lens that we use to assess the performance. Because if we look at the absolute score gains, meaning who actually gained the most points, then this would favor countries that started farther from the upper boundary, that were less developed in the 1990s. And we already saw that the best performing country in this regard was Bhutan. We may also look at the rank change. So basically comparing the performance of a country with every other country. And in this regard, we've seen that the best performing country was the Maldives, but also Bhutan, I think, was one of the best performing countries as well. And the other perspective that we took in the paper was that we actually looked at how much the distance to full 100 score in the SPI was reduced. So in other words, who closed most of its initial gap to the best possible performance. And we found out that if we did this analysis, then it would be South Korea actually performing the best. Here, however, we need to say that this lens actually favors countries that are rather near the 100 score boundary. These evaluations or assessments of the performance are not competing against each other. They are complementary, and we need to use them to get a better perspective on social progress. The visualization here on the slide is just to show you how we actually looked at the performance of individual countries through so-called country profiles that are also available on the Social Progress Index, Social Progress Imperative website. So here we looked at the different trends in terms of the scores, ranks, compared the trends of the SPI against GDP per capita development, dimensions trends, component trends, and then compare the performance in 2020 to the original year of 1990. So what the paper shows is that social progress index increased in almost every country, but this progress was very uneven in terms of the aspects of social progress, so the different components of the social progress. It was uneven in terms of time, and it was uneven in terms of individual countries. And if I should pick one of the concerns or the main concerns based on the data, that would be the opportunity dimension and namely rights and inclusiveness, because they were performing the worst over those 31 years. It is also important to acknowledge that the framework is anchored in today's concept. So this is something that I was already talking about, and one of the consequences is actually the big improvement in the access to information and communication component. Also, another issue is the fact that some indicators or outcomes cannot be measured globally, and also the fact that the time series ends in 2020. But as I said, we are now already working on the update of the index. So this brings me to the last part of the presentation, which will be very quick. I just want to show you how we extended the research based on the Social Progress Index time series. So in the first one, and this is a book chapter from Elgar Companion to Data and Indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals, which should be out probably later this year, where we wrote a chapter on inequalities beyond income. So we actually used the time series index to assess how global inequalities across countries, how they changed from 1990 to 2020. So we basically reframed the time series as an evidence on inequality beyond income across countries. But what we also did, and this is what you can actually see on the slide and in the visualization, is that we compared the distribution of country scores when we use unweighted scores, so we didn't weight them by population of countries, and when we weighted them by population of countries for the index and for the individual dimensions. And what you can see here is actually that countries improved more than improved the population weighted scores in terms of many components. And this improvement is specifically seen in the basic human needs dimension, the upper right panel, and in the foundations of well-being dimension, which is the bottom left panel. And you can also still see the division and the uneven results, and not a clear improvement, or so much of a clear improvement in the opportunity dimension, which is the bottom right panel, which brought us to a question whether we should actually look at a global convergence in social progress. So we did this. You see the names of the authors here. This work was led by Jesus Peiro Palomino, and we wanted to see whether there was a convergence in social societal outcomes. Um, we looked at the convergence in the overall index and in the dimensions. And what we found is that there is a convergence in the basic human needs and foundations of well-being dimensions. So countries are improving and getting more alike in these two dimensions, but there is no global convergence in the opportunity dimension. So what we kind of saw from the results of the global index and from some previous analysis was has now been confirmed, and actually this paper was just published. I think it's been like 2 weeks. It's out for 2 weeks now. So, and because there is no global convergence in the opportunity dimension, there is no global convergence in the social progress index as such. Then we looked at the convergence within the opportunity dimension, and we found 6 convergence clubs, as you can see on this slide. They do not cross, their trajectories do not cross. On the map, you can see the different convergence clubs in terms of the opportunity dimension. We also look at some factors that are correlated with countries being in the better performing clubs. And we saw that higher performing clubs are associated with lower population growth, higher GDP per capita, larger tertiary sector, higher democracy and economic freedom. However, of course, these are not causal effects. These are just associations. And one last note is that, as you can see from the map, most of the world's population still remains in intermediate or low opportunity trajectories. So to sum up the entire presentation, and to conclude with some messages to take forward, we've seen that the global social progress was real. The world SPI increased significantly. However, the momentum has weakened, and it has been quite slow actually in the most recent period. And also, what still creates a main concern is the opportunity dimension. Opportunity performance still remains divided, and we've seen that while countries are converging together in basic human needs and foundations of well-being dimension, this is not the case in the opportunity dimension. So yes, to conclude with some messages, I think it's worth measuring social outcomes separately from income. It's worth looking at a long time series, preserve comparability over time, and we should mostly now focus our policy attention on the institutions that should promote and expand opportunities, because as we have seen, this is probably the main concern. Thank you so much.
Professor Harmáček, thank you so much for an engaging and insightful presentation. I knew it would be, and so many questions, so many ideas, so many thoughts come to mind. While we get ready, I see in our audience, we have Doctors Emadayo, Mishu, and Kipenda, as well as Vidi Tiwari. I ask that you join the stage so that you'd be here and ready to ask your questions, offer your comments, because this is an amazing opportunity to have access to Professor Harmáček. And while we're waiting for people to join, Jaromir, I love this paper because it answers a lot of the validity and reliability questions that come up about the index, especially when you have an index that's looking at environmental factors, not just, and I love the fact that you say GDP is not a destination. And so the brilliance of that, and especially when we're looking at how the opportunity dimension has not converged, it's it's separated. But allow me to go into the weeds a little bit with you on the issue of changing technology, and when you look at, you know, I'm thinking of social progress in the global majority and how we use changing technology to help us to intervene at certain points. I'm thinking of the indicator of mobile versus landline subscriptions and how that's increased. It's a blessing and a curse. However, if you're thinking of public health interventions, opportunities for information regarding risks, that poses a significant opportunity for people in public health when you use like ecological momentary assessment tools and those kinds of things. We rely on mobile units to allow us to do that. Talk a little bit about that technological, because landlines, it used to be landline. If you didn't have a landline, you were sunk. You're in a rural area or you're in a remote region or wherever you are in the global majority. The uptick in mobile as an indicator. Just spend a little time with me talking about how that looks beyond 2020.
Yeah. Well, as I said during my presentation, this was one of the biggest issue that we faced in terms of the index construction, because I mean, in the information and communications component, so we usually were looking at the two indicators. There are actually three indicators, but these two indicators that I'm going to talk about are more related to technology. So one is the internet users, so how much people use internet, so it's the percentage of people that use internet, and these mobile phones versus landline phones subscriptions. And if we go back to the 1990s, early 1990s, 1990, so you start with internet users at zero and mobile phones at zero as well, right? So having these two indicators in the information and communication components only basically would not show much in terms of the progress in the early 90s. So we had to somehow came up with a solution and to brought an indicator that would better measure what was the progress back then in the 1990s in the technology. Internet that was non-existent basically everywhere. And in terms of the communications, so we decided to use the indicator that was available, and that was the landline subscriptions recalculated per 100 inhabitants. And the same thing we did with the mobile phones. So we decided to combine them in a way that we put more weight at the landlines indicator in the early 90s. And actually we created the weights in a counter-parallel way. So in the late 2010s, we actually put much more weight on the mobile phone indicator. And this way we combine these two indicators to give us some proxy of the technological changes from the 1990s to 2020, which was the final year. Now, in the global index that we publish every year, and which usually goes back to the 2011, which is the starting year, and then we recalculate to until the most recent year, which for the current edition is 2025. We don't have to do this, because in 2011, you already distinguish countries technologically quite nicely using the mobile phone indicators itself. So this is not needed in the annual index creation, but this was definitely needed in the time series index that goes back to 1990. And of course, some people may say, and this is exactly what we were saying to us as well, if you look at the progress in terms of the information and communications component, it's huge. It's more than 50 points on the world level. So is this really the case? And you would see one thing is that you would see progress even without this indicator, but the progress would be, of course, without this component, but the progress would be reduced. The other thing is that, as you say, that the technological options and possibilities nowadays are really huge. And sometimes when I think about the early 1990s, when I was really young, but I still remember a lot of things from that time. And when you compare it to the present, it's basically uncomparable. So maybe the 50 points is too much, and that's why in the current update of the time series we want to actually employ some other indicators in this component as well to reduce this progress, to look more at the democracy in terms of getting to information and these kind of things. But I think the technological progress has been huge, and without it, we would not be even able to have this conversation today.
Yes, indeed. Wonderful. Thank you. We could go on and on for hours on this, but I'll come back to you offline. Dr. Michoud, your thoughts, questions, comments, and then Vidi, I go to you after. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Oh, a wonderful presentation. And I certainly am going to go back and take a look more in depth at the papers, because this was a lot to to gather. So I really appreciate it. That was really some wonderful work. Just a question that I had in reference to your thoughts on, you mentioned gender parity, and what you're going to be doing from here on in. I'd like to hear a little bit about that, and whether you think that this is really going to have maybe a worsening impact really on your opportunities indicators. So eventually, when you start to do your next 5 years or next 10 years, I'd like to hear a little bit about your thinking on gender parity and where that might go.
Thank you very much for this question. So the way we were working with gender parity, so we had two gender parity indicators in the framework of the time series index. Both were related to parity in education, one in secondary attainment and the other one in tertiary education attainment. So the way we approached it was basically taking the ratio of the female indicator to the male indicator and take the absolute distance to 1, so that we actually, if the value is so basically this helped us not only to maintain the gender equality or inequality aspect, but also the direction of where the inequality goes. But with this, there are some issues related to the way you actually measure the disparities that goes in favor of females. So males are the ones that are disadvantaged. So, and that's purely statistical. So we decided to actually avoid looking at the direction and to look only at the inequality. So we just take the ratio of the two indicators, and whichever has the bigger value is in the denominator. So basically, it's just like looking only at the disparity itself, not whether males or females are more disadvantaged. So I think this helps us to avoid some slight statistical complications that we have with the previous indicator, and maybe it's also more theoretical sound as well. In terms of how this will affect the index, I don't think that it will affect the index that much. In terms of secondary parity, secondary education parity, I think that in most of the cases we've seen gender disadvantaged females. It was not so much of the case in the tertiary attainment. So I don't think that this actually will have an impact on the index substantially. I don't think so. But methodologically, I think this is more sound.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Vidi, did you have a comment or a question?
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. This was such an in-depth study about social progress, and I really enjoyed the whole, from 1990s to 2020, you've done this excellent in-depth research of all the parameters for social progress. One thing that came to my mind, and there was a lot of food for thought, but one thing that really stuck with me was that after 2020, which is what I was thinking about, that there has been a lot of change in the world that we're living in. There are so many conflicts that are going on. And one of the countries that actually did well in the past 20, 30 years, that was Myanmar, has also gone through, so much political turmoil, and I'm sure that would also lead to a lot of changes in their progress. If you look at the post 2020 period, and similarly for a country like India, where I come from, on paper we're a perfect not a perfect democracy, but we're a democracy on paper, and we're the largest democracy in the world. But if you look at the reality, it's grim, right? And a lot of the opportunity indicators were about free press and political rights, and that might be assured by the government in theory at least. But what I want to know more about is that when you're collecting data for such indicators, let's say equality and rights and access to those rights, how do you see political authority, and how do you understand the effect of that political authority? It's in its reality, not just that, oh, we claim we are a democracy and so everything is good. But then while we're collecting that data, how does that show up in an indicator or an index that measures social progress?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So in terms of the post 2020 development, yes, I very much agree. I mean, we stopped the time series in 2020, meaning that we didn't see basically any consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have not been able to measure anything related to the current political tensions in the world. We may not be able to do so even with the update of the index, because there is always a delay with in the indicators that are published. So let's see how about that. But yeah, I mean, we can only use the indicators that exist, and that to some extent also answers to your second question, because I mean, so what we have some rules how we are actually creating the individual components. So in terms of rights or inclusive society, or even with the other components. So what you want to make sure, and sometimes it's not that possible, is that you combine indicators from more sources, you combine more types of data, such as harder data, or with expert assessment, or with some subjective indicators, if they are available, so that you actually reduce the bias coming from the specific source or the specific type of the data, and so on. It is, for us, this is much more manageable in the global annual editions of the index, because data are more available. If you want to come back to 1990, you just have to use the sources that actually provide data that are comparable across countries over those years for all 31 years, 1990 to 2020, or with this update even more years. So it's more difficult. But the general answer to this question would be that if you want to have a sound component and sound index, then of course, but you start with the component. So if you want to have a sound component measuring rights or measuring freedoms or whatever, you just would like to include indicators that come from different sources, that are differently measured, and that are maybe even different types of indicators, so that you reduce the possible bias that come from those sources, types of indicators, and these kind of things. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse in terms of the opportunity indicators or components. yes, to some extent, one of the most significant resources that we use is the varieties of democracy indicators. But again, you need to work with what is available. And this is a wonderful source of data. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat from Dr. Imadayo. Thank you very much for this comprehensive, relevant, but quite complex study. How would we objectively interpret a 1343 composite point global increase over a 30-year period in statistical and practical terms?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. So objectively, so you always calibrate each indicator using the best case and the worst case scenario. So 100 is the best ideal scenario in terms of each indicator. So for example, if I have a maternal mortality indicator and I say that the ideal scenario is that no mother dies, then country would get the score of 100 in that particular indicator if no mother dies. Yeah. So this is how we calibrate the indicators. We go indicator by indicator, and we assess what is the best ideal scenario and what is also the worst possible scenario. We call these utopias and dystopias. And for sometimes for the dystopias, this is really difficult because, I mean, what is the worst possible scenario in maternal mortality? That all mothers die? I don't think so, because I mean, theoretically yes, of course, but in practical terms, it's not the case, because I mean, that would of course basically distort the 100 scores that we want to calculate, right? So we usually base, where possible, we base the dystopias, the worst case scenarios, on the worst observed data over 1990 to 2020. We do this slightly differently for the annual index. So to come back to the question, so a social progress of 100 would basically mean that a country scores the best ideal values in each indicator in the index. And score of the index of 0 would mean that a country scores the worst possible value, the dystopias, in each indicator. Now, the world performance. We take all countries, population weight them, and aggregate all countries by using this population weighted average to a world value in terms of raw indicators. So we create basically another country. The world for us is another country. It's all countries to another country. And then for the world, as well as for all other countries, we do our calculations. So this 13.43 improvement would mean that if a world was a country, it would improve in its, and the world would be composed of all the countries that we include in the social progress index. Then this country, the world, would improve its social progress from I don't remember the scores, but by 13.43 points, where 0 would be a score where the world would be actually at the dystopias for every indicator, and 100 would be at the scores, at the best scores of each indicator. So this would be the objective interpretation.
Yes, brilliantly. Oh my goodness. Oh, we could do this for hours. And I want you to know, Professor Harmáček, that in this little space, you have an audience that includes Bangladesh, India, and I'm not even saying what part of India, the US, parts of the US, Zambia. This is the whole idea of this interaction, because these indices are critical to so what we do about this. How do you point out the points of intervention? And so this has been uniquely informative, a great opportunity. And I hope that we could continue some of this dialogue, and good to hear that you're going to do a follow-on paper, because a lot of the questions that come about validity and reliability, you answer in papers like this. This is an ongoing index that has value, and there are questions. That said, I see Margot has come on stage and wondering if you have a question.
I was hoping to have the last word, actually, and I just wanted to get but since you're asking if I have a question, Jaromir, look, the timing of this is incredibly important. As I was saying to you before we started, given the trends that we're seeing globally and some of the things that even in your data up to 2020, you're already previewing some things that we've seen unfolding rather dramatically, that this work is critically important at this juncture. You know it, but I think it's important for us, especially in this community, to acknowledge that. I am particularly interested in some of your subnational work. And for now, the broad question is, in your final remarks, you talked about the direction of social progress in general up to that point, the fact that the momentum is weakening, we know, and it would be nice to know what happens post-2020. I think everybody knows which direction it's headed. And then, of course, on the opportunity side, which is the weakest in terms of performance. But as I listen to you, and I think you probably know, many of these indicators are interrelated. You know, if you get progress in one, it's likely to improve the chances. So if you take democracy, for example, where you're saying where there's stronger democracy, you get better performance, right? And I just wondered to the extent that some of your analysis may actually try to look at, if not causality, at least, or the weakest concurrence, but perhaps correlation between some of those. And I'm particularly interested in it from the perspective of opportunity, which is really, really an important dynamic that we overlook in terms of how it impacts not just economic stability, but also well-being. You know, it affects most other other indicators. And have you looked at that? One. Two, have you seen some differences in the trends when you look within a country borders at the subnational level?
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. In terms of the correlations, the way we create the index is basically exactly as you pointed out. So to create a component of the index, we need indicators that correlate together. So there is a correlation. In a way, you can say that if one indicator performs well, other indicators will be performing as well. This is basically the rule how the composite indicators are created, because you cannot, from statistical reasons, but also for conceptual reasons, you cannot really include indicators that go against the rest of the indicators in the component. So this is exactly what we do when we create the index. But then we know that there are many other indicators that go the other direction. For example, I don't know, climate change, the CO2 emissions per capita or material footprint. So we do not intentionally include them in the index, but then we leave them out of the framework. We take the index or the dimensions or the components and look at the relationship between this index or its elements and those indicators that cannot or could not be used in the index. So yes, we do this, and actually with colleagues of mine, and this work was led by my former colleague Mohamed Htitish. So we actually looked at the relationship between social progress and CO2 emissions and material footprint to come up with a score that we called, we're still calling it just transition score, and we have another paper about it. Basically, how the environmental sustainability of the social progress would look like. So this just transition score is about that, and I think this precisely answers your question. So you cannot include all indicators when you create the index. Some of them just don't fit, but you keep them out, and you take your index and you do the follow-up analysis of your index against those measures. And we do the same thing with the GDP, for example. So that was one question. And yes, I agree very much that the indices that I usually work on are focused on countries. So they use like national averages, if I may say so. So they show the differences across countries in the world, but they don't show the differences within countries. And that's of course something that the subnational indices should look at. I have been involved in some subnational analysis, even though it's not my main focus of the work anymore. And yes, you can see that. I mean, usually the data availability for the subnational indices is a little bit worse.
It's weaker.
But you still can and it's actually, I think that all subnational indices are very informative, because you can look within countries, you can look at the differences within countries, and if you have the data, you can also look at the time series within a country, and that gives you incredible amount of information.
And I'm just going to put a pin on this, and I would like to have a follow-up conversation with you on it. I think, coming back to the other Dr. Thomas's question about technology, I see opportunities. They're risky, but I think they're worth testing, especially when you're looking in subnational context, to get an additional layers of granularity, and therefore the ability to interpret data, because you can use other sources of information, one, particularly coming from people within communities. So that's one thing. And that's more authentic, right? Especially if you're looking at things on perceptions, right? But also, I think that it would help us to better understand what we see as national averages, right? The third point is, as you say, how the indicators are constructed. You're looking at things that essentially move in the same direction. And to be honest, the risk of that is that we're actually amplifying a particular view or desire, and therefore amplifying any errors that we may have. But we understand that. So your counter to looking at things beyond outside of your indicator and then doing the comparison is helpful. But I wonder how, when you do this on the subnational level, how do you safeguard against gaming? We know there's a whole political economy, okay, involved, and I can explain my background and the potency of this question. I'm not setting you a trap, but I just want to know what are some of the safeguards you can put in place, especially when you're looking at a subnational level and the analysis that you're doing.
As I said, it's much more difficult on the subnational level, because the availability of indicators and the availability of data is worse. So usually you try to follow the same rules. You try to combine indicators, you try to combine sources if it's possible. If it's not possible, then you just need to work with what is available, but everything needs to be transparent and clearly described in a methodology report, or in an accompanying report. Doesn't have to be methodology, right? Because I mean, even with the global work, I think that's quite similar actually. You work with what is available. You do some methodological choices. Sometimes they are based on your value judgment, and you just need to record it. You just need to put it in the methodology report so that everyone knows how you've done it. And in the end of the day, I try to think about the indices as basically like an ongoing work, an ongoing process. So basically you do your thing, and that doesn't mean that the thing is done, because then you collect feedback, you realize that something can be done differently. So if there is the possibility of doing an update, then you just should improve. Then you just should improve the tool that you're working on.
Right. Yeah, and you also have the room to make corrections. You can go retroactively.
Sure.
And ultimately, it has to be you have to be able to replicate it, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, there goes your validity and reliability. I just want to thank you for taking this time. And I wonder if Dr. Kipenda, I see you've put your camera up. Since you're coming in from Zambia, I want your question, please. You're on mute. There you go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for that. And Professor, really appreciate this lecture. For me, it was a lecture because there was a lot of learning happening. And just before this information, we've had these conversations around working with GDP. So just a brief context, in my having elections, general elections, in a couple of days. So we've been hearing a lot of conversations around our economy from the government, particularly the president. Our president is an economist. So he uses conversations, he uses terms like our GDP is doing so well, and as a country, we have done so well from the time we came in. So that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, everybody wants their GDP to improve. But now looking at this framework and how you've described it, that GDP is actually a complementary aspect to calculating the social progress index, and that we have these indicators that in reality we are struggling with. For example, the basic needs. I don't think we have really measured that per se, but just based off observations and small inputs that are coming in from different implementation programs. Healthcare, for example, we can see that it's depreciating. People are spending more to access healthcare. And generally, Zambians are not agreeing that we are doing well as a country, despite the GDP doing so well. So my question is, are we right to think that really we might not be measuring our progress so well, and maybe we are missing out certain components? For example, how the president is echoing so much on improved GDP, yet we see that our basic needs are still not as met as they should be, and there's no opportunities. And then the second question is, what conversations then should we, if that's the case, what conversations should we be having within the country subnationally, as Dr. Thomas put it, looking at the subnational context from communities? What conversations should we be having to convince leaders like the president, who's very convinced that the country is doing way much better, when us who are in these communities are struggling? We are failing to even meet basic needs like just having our staple food. So what conversations should we be bringing out so that we, at some extent, reach the aspects of this framework of calculating the social progress index? Yeah, so that's the question I had.
Thank you so much. I'll start with the first one, because I think it's maybe a bit more manageable for me. So in terms of GDP, I mean, I don't think GDP is a bad indicator per se. It just needs to be used to the things that it was aimed at, and it measures economic output. So, and if you recalculate it per population, you get an idea of an average level of economic development. But is actually improving GDP the goal itself? I don't think so. I mean, it's a good mean to achieve better life for people. So I'm not anti-growth at all, but at the same time, I think the economic growth should be actually a mean that supports societal well-being, because that should be the goal. That should be the end, right? People should be living better lives, and if economic growth helps to it, that's great. But if it's not helping, there must be a problem somewhere, I guess.
Distribution.
So yeah, I mean, it couldn't be distribution, but I think it's not only distribution, it's also those channels, how economic growth actually fed these societal outcomes. So distribution is one thing, I agree, but it's not the entire story.
Yeah.
So economic growth is important, but it's not the end. It should not stop there, and it should not be like we're growing and therefore we're fine. No, we're growing, and that needs to be reflected in people's lives, and then it's good.
Well, excellent.
So
That's perfect. Hopefully that answers your question. And I want to, Dr. Kipenda, point out that I was tickled that Professor Harmáček used the maternal and child health as a medical doctor who focuses on maternal child health for the utopia-dystopia example. So we've come full cycle, full round. I was worried that we would have too much time for this lecture. And I'm calling it a lecture too, because it was an amazing lecture, very informative on all levels. And now we are over time. So I was worried that, won't have much people wouldn't relate, but here we are. So Professor Harmáček, I want you to know the potency of the work you and your colleagues are doing and how it resonates across professions at every level. Not just at the for economists, but for epidemiologists like myself, for medical doctors like Dr. Kipenda. You had two medical doctors on the line, and you had another public health professional in Dr. Michoud. Dr. Margot doesn't count because you economists take over everything. I'm saying that as an inside joke. You've had a range of people. And the benefit of this index, we all follow it, and we see the significance of the work. And so once again, I want to thank you for this amazing lecture, and I hope that Vidi Tiwari is saying this was a very insightful conversation. Thank you, Professor Jaromir. And so I echo that. And sadly, I need to bring this to a close, and I look forward to another opportunity in talking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a true pleasure for me to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, thank you all, and thank you. We bring this particular seminar to a close. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.